Hello, my name is Bridget Charlton, and today I will be presenting to you my research for William Patterson University's Cognitive Science Honors Track titled Radio Rhythms: Do Prosodic Changes in DJ Talk Breaks Affect Listening Comprehension? So before I get into my presentation, I would like to note that if you are interested in reading my full paper or watching my more in-depth presentation as I had recorded for William Patterson University's Honors Week, you can access that in the full thesis tab of my booth. Now without any further ado, let's get into the study. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of it, it's very important to understand what prosody is. Prosody, much as it is the backbone of this study, is the rhythmic backbone of spoken language. It encompasses all of the various traits that shape how speech is perceived and understood, our spoken profile, so to speak. And the reason that I was interested in this is I wanted to investigate the relationship between prosody and listening comprehension in radio, as specific radio broadcasters have prosodies that they switch into depending on what they are presenting. In Gasser, Napoli, and Zhu's 2019 study, we can see that news broadcasters have a very specific and very importantly recognizable speech pattern which listeners had associated with newscasts. Not only did they associate this with newscasts, but listeners, even when untrained, were able to recognize errors when untrained broadcasters tried to emulate this pattern. Therefore, instead of doing as other studies had done in analyzing individual variables such as stress, speech rate, and intonation, I wanted to see if changing the overall profile of the prosody would affect how an individual is able to comprehend the information being presented to them. My participants were randomly given one of 5 conditions, each of which included 5 demographic questions, 5 fake radio clips, and 6 questions per clip. All of my questions were half opinion-based and half content-based, so there were 3 opinion-based questions and 3 content-based questions. And each clip was between 15 and 25 seconds long, which focused on a different topic, was read by a trained college radio broadcaster, and could only be listened to once. Unfortunately, my findings found that prosodic changes do not affect listening comprehension in the way that I had hypothesized. However, there were still some interesting findings nonetheless. So for my participants, I had 136 participants overall. However, only 104 were usable for data based on their level of completion. All of my participants were college students, and 57 were male, 43 female, and 4 had preferred not to say or identified as other. Out of these 104, 83 of my participants were monolingual and 21 were multilingual. All of my participants had a fluent understanding and execution of the English language. I had then split up my participants into 3 main groups based on their majors. First, we have communications-related majors, of which we had 23. This means that their field of study relates somehow to the broadcasting aspect of my research, which might help them when taking the study. 6 were related sciences majors, which mainly focused on communication disorder and linguistics majors, so future audiologists, speech language pathologists, etc., that would have a finer understanding of prosody. And finally, everyone else was grouped into the non-related majors category, of which I had 75. For my procedure, I distributed my survey through Qualtrics, and all of my participants remained anonymous. My participants were randomly assigned to one of 5 possible conditions or orders in which they would hear all 5 prosodies and all 5 scripts. However, they were rearranged and matched differently. So if you look below that in the middle column, we have condition 1 and condition 2. So green represents chirpy, yellow represents rising, gray represents smooth, orange represents news, and blue represents flat. Those are my 5 prosodies. And then the order in which they heard everything for all 5 conditions was a weather script, a music script, a sports script, a science script, and then an international script. So what does this actually mean? So for chirpy, this is something that you might hear on a morning radio show, especially on a popular rock or a pop station. This is Z100, and everything sounds much higher in the register and like you're smiling. Therefore, the phonemes are a lot wider. Rising intonation is something that you might hear more often in Spanish newscasting. The broadcaster stays very, very consistent with their tone until the very, very end, in which it spikes and then comes back down to that even tone. Smooth is something that you might hear on a classical or jazz radio station or late-night program. So as you can imagine, everything is very glossed over and rests in the lower part of the speaker's voice. News is the most recognizable of all of them, in which in English newscasting we have almost a sing-songy prosody. This is something that you are probably very accustomed to hearing on your local news station, both on the TV and on radio. You have a lot of highs and lows, again, very sing-songy. And of course, flat acted as our control, in which there were no real prosodic elements. It was very flat and very boring, so to speak. So again, in condition 1, we can see that weather was read in chirpy, whereas in condition 2, weather was read in a rising intonation. And we have a screenshot in which all of my participants saw that they would only be able to listen to the recording once, but that they could play whenever they were ready. For my results. Unfortunately, again, there was no significant difference for the number correct on the questions based on rhythm. However, when we go to the following graph, number correct by rhythm clustered by gender, we do see an interesting finding in which our male participants did better than the female participants on only the news prosody. And then finally, in the top right corner, the number correct by script. This was interesting because we saw two main differences. Participants did significantly worse on not only the international news script, but also sports. Particularly the communications-related majors did worse on sports. So what does this tell us? So, of course, contrary to my hypothesis, there was no difference strictly in prosody. However, we do see that in newspeak there is a difference between males and females. The reason that I believe individuals had more difficulty with the international news script as well as the sports news script is because of familiarity bias. In only those two scripts were actual sports teams and actual location names used instead of fabricated ones. So I believe that, especially for our communications related majors who might have a higher understanding of sports from their sports broadcasting on our sports radio and TV programs, they would have a bias in it. Oh, I don't know that player name. I don't remember that happening, but I know these teams, as well as in the international script in which I had discussed a fake news story with the current situation in Venezuela. Most individuals are very familiar with what is happening in Venezuela, and therefore their previous information bias affected their answers. If I were to do this in the future, I would make sure that I have a more even distribution of my participants as a beginning point. So first of all, I would want more multilingual participants to see if certain rhythms from different cultures, such as the rising aspect, if Spanish speakers, Spanish-English bilinguals did better on the rising as opposed to their English monolingual peers. I would also want a more even distribution amongst the majors. We had a lot of non-related majors. I would love to see more related communications as well as science majors. Beyond that, if you would like to read more about what I did, feel free to look at my full thesis or email me with any questions that you may have. Thank you so much. This has been my research, Radio Rhythms. Do prosodic changes in DJ talk breaks affect listening comprehension?